They say one conversation can change the course of a life. For Ethan Cole, it began with a stranger on a train. He was 23 when the ache started. Not the simple ache of tired muscles or sleepless nights, but a hollow that rent through certainty. He had done everything he was told to do: graduate, get a stable job, save a little, never make rash decisions. He kept the checklist of adulthood like a talisman, and still the list did not grant him peace. Day after day, he watched time pass in meetings that multiplied without meaning, and paychecks that scarcely edged his sense of possibility. He felt rich in knowledge of what not to do, poor in the knowledge that actually moved mountains. One damp Tuesday, with rain still whispering on the windows, Ethan boarded a late train out of the city with nothing but a small bag and a battered journal. He wanted space to think, or perhaps he wanted the illusion of motion to quiet the dissonance inside him. The carriage smelled of coffee and wet coats. People scrolled, read, slept. He sat by the window and wrote, but the words were flat and circular. Across from him sat a man who seemed to belong to no one place. His jacket was simple, his shoes unostentatious, but he carried a presence like someone who had sat too often at the edge of important decisions and learned to be still. His hair had the kind of salt that speaks of long winters and long flights. He looked at Ethan with the same calm curiosity an old tree gives a wandering bird. When the train hummed in its rhythm, the man spoke without preamble. Running from something? Or running toward something? Ethan blinked, surprised by the soft precision of the question. He had rehearsed answers for interviews, for friends, for his future self, but none of those answers fit this. This was direct, immediate. Maybe both, he said finally. The man smiled. Then you're not lost. You are searching. He introduced himself as Adrian Vale. There was no grand title in the way he said it, just a name that sounded like a place people would say in stories later on. Vale, as if shadows and lights lived in it together. Ethan felt, oddly and immediately, that he could trust him. Trust had never been a currency in Ethan's life, and yet here it felt like a doorway. They left the train waiting for no one, and walked through a town where the baker already stacked warm loaves, and the florist arranged last night's rain into bright shapes. Adrian invited Ethan for coffee. They sat at a small table and talked until the sun slid away, and the town lamps began to look like distant beacons. "Tell me one thing," Adrian said over his cup. "If you had all the money you needed, would you do the same work you do today?" Ethan thought of spreadsheets and small promotions, and of the slow persecution of routine. "No," he admitted. "I'd do something different. I'd build things that lasted. I'd help people learn trades. I'd give time to things that matter." Adrian nodded, as if Ethan's answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then you already have a direction. We will make it a map." They did not become friends in a single gesture. Friendship, in their case, was the slow recognition of aim and the choice to travel together. Adrian did not offer formulas or manifestos. He offered questions, examples, and stories. Raw, practical stories, stripped of motivational vines and full of hard, testable truths. He taught Ethan in a way that refused to insult his intelligence, by making the abstract visible. "You have been taught to respect hustle," Adrian said one evening as they walked along a shoreline where the waves spoke in patient measures. "Hustle is a force, but not a plan. It will move you forward, but it will not carry you beyond the horizon unless you build mechanisms. The key to a billionaire mindset is not a number in your bank. It is the architecture of your life." Ethan listened. The phrase, "architecture of your life," lodged in him like the first stone of a foundation. Adrian's lessons were grouped not by chapters, but by the kinds of mistakes he had seen people make. He called them the pillars: leverage, compounding, ownership, optionality, integrity, and stewardship. He stressed that none of these worked alone. They were interdependent like organs in a body. Leverage came first, because without it, raw work is just a treadmill. Adrian told the story of two brothers who inherited a small workshop. One brother, Milo, worked the forge every hour, producing beautiful pieces with his hands. The other, Jonah, learned to design tools that allowed apprentices to produce under his guidance. Milo made more in a year than Jonah at first, but when demand grew, Jonah's approach scaled. He built systems, templates for designs, a training regimen, a supply chain, and his efforts earned he and the town steady income. Milo's hands, though talented, were limited. The lesson was clear: find ways to multiply the impact of your time. Leverage is a lever, Adrian said, tapping the table as if emphasizing the point with small percussion. You want to move mountains with small effort. Learn to build machines, not muscle. Ethan began to notice the hidden levers around him. Code that automated menial tasks, online storefronts that sold the same product to thousands, partnerships that allowed one person's skill to reach millions. He practiced designing processes for trivial things, automating invoices, streamlining client onboarding, templating deliverables. The early wins were humble but decisive. He learned the quiet joy of a task that finished itself once set in motion. Next came compounding, which Adrian taught with both math and metaphor. He talked numbers plainly, but returned again and again to the deeper truth. Repeated action builds magnitude. $20 every week invested becomes power over decades, he said. But compound patience, compound learning, compound relationships, those are the infinities. He showed Ethan a simple spreadsheet. Small disciplines added together became a fortress. A person who read one meaningful book a month, who wrote one page a week, who made one small investment every month would in 10 years be unrecognizable compared to one who consumed frivolity and deferred growth. Compound interest, he proved, was not only about money. It was the quiet force that turns small choices into lives. Ownership was subtler. Adrian's voice took on a firmer edge when he spoke of it. Ownership is the difference between temporary employment and durable freedom. You can be industrious and still vulnerable. If the source of your income can be revoked with the click of a button, you are not building wealth. You are renting your life. He told of a programmer who devoted his career to a single company and was laid off overnight. He told of a farmer who claimed a few acres, persisted, and over time created a distribution business that allowed him to employ dozens. Own a part of the system that pays you, Adrian advised. Equity, intellectual property, a product, ownership over your time. These are currencies that change your relationship with life. Ethan began to split his attention, not in distraction, but in diversification. He maintained his job while he built side projects that could one day be islands of income. He wrote short courses, offered them to a few friends, and slowly made a list of customers who were willing to pay for what he taught. He understood, for the first time, that a job could be a platform for something else if he treated it with intention. Optionality was a pillar Adrian treated with reverence. Options are choices, he said. The person with options can say no. They can pick the path that aligns with meaning instead of being trapped by fear. He explained financial options in layman's terms, but spent more time on the psychological kind. The ability to walk away from a bad partner, to leave a job that corrodes, to say yes to a new experiment without sinking everything. He told stories of founders who had taken small bets rather than all-in gambles. They kept runway, they learned more, and when the right window opened, they moved with speed. This caution was not cowardice. It was strategic patience. Adrian's next lesson was the moral engine, integrity. Wealth, he said plainly, is a trust you hold in compounding. When you break trust, you fracture the things wealth depends on: reputation, network, and the willingness of others to do business with you. He spoke of people who chased profit while shrinking the promise they made to the world. He showed Ethan how contracts, clear expectations, and simple courtesy create an invisible capital that pays dividends. The last pillar, and perhaps the one that felt most human, was stewardship. Adrian framed wealth as a stewardship, resources temporarily entrusted to you to move forward a larger story. If you see wealth as a tool for accumulation only, you will build brittle monuments, he said. If you see it as a tool to create more agency in others, you build an ecosystem. Adrian did not practice a showy, philanthropic piety. His giving had design. He set up microfunds for entrepreneurs who would not otherwise receive aid. He taught classes for minimal fees with scholarships reserved for the most determined. He measured impact with the same rigorous eye he reserved for product metrics. For him, generosity was not sentimentality. It was an engineered multiplier. Ethan took notes. He began living by tests Adrian gave him. Simple daily experiments to reorient growth. Track every expense for a month. Automate one thing. Teach one small class. Give away 5% of your profit and observe what happens. The tests were practical, and in their smallness, brutal. Ethan noticed how small sacrifices opened doors. The test of giving repeatedly surprised him. Generosity softened negotiations rather than weakening his position. They worked together in the real world. Adrian could have been a philosopher. Instead, he was a building contractor of habits. He introduced Ethan to people who embodied different aspects of the pillars. An engineer who designed modular supply chains. A baker who franchised with dignity. A teacher who swapped a secure salary for the better leverage of owning a training company. Ethan's first experiment was modest. He negotiated with an online maker to white label his small training videos, turning them into a packaged course. He did not rush to scale. He iterated the content, listened to feedback, and improved the system for onboarding students. Within a year, the course paid for a part-time assistant and then a studio. Tiny marks of progress that, in his old life, would have seemed miraculous. It was during the early wins that Adrian introduced the tension every beginner meets. The seduction of scale versus the ethic of quality. Scale amplifies both strengths and flaws, Adrian warned. You will be tempted to trade fidelity for growth. Always ask, does this scale the core value or the compromise? Ethan watched as some founders took shortcuts that accelerated growth but left product quality in tatters. He learned to build guardrails, quality gates, minimum acceptable standards, and hiring practices that aligned with mission. He accepted the slower but sure compounding that builds trust. Luck and humility were woven through Adrian's lessons like a thin, golden thread. Recognize luck where it touches your life, he said one night, looking up at a sky smudged with city light. Some things happen because of choices. Other things happen because of timing and aid and accidents. Acknowledging luck protects you from the arrogance of absolute self-credit and fuels gratitude. Ethan found this disconcerting. He had been raised on narratives of meritocracy, the idea that effort alone should account for outcomes. Adrian did not deny effort. He elevated the conversation. Merit matters, he said, but context, timing, and community matter too. When you understand that, you learn to invest in structures that multiply help for others, rather than hoard the advantage. He began to make habits of gratitude. Every month, he wrote down 3 unforeseen favors that had helped him, and the names of people who had unlocked them. He found that naming the good neither minimized his work nor inflated his ego. It grounded him. It nudged him toward reciprocity. The path was not linear. Ethan's experiments failed in ordinary ways. A supplier vanished in the middle of fulfilling an order. A co-founder grew impatient. A client refused to pay. Each crisis reverberated, but Adrian's lessons were always oriented toward repair. Systems are tested in storms, Adrian taught him. If you only build for fair weather, you build vanity. Design for resilience. They rehearsed failure as a teacher. When a marketing campaign flopped, Adrian did not scold. He opened his notebook and mapped the failure. What assumptions had they made? Which were invalidated? And how could they create a safer test next time? Ethan learned to keep a failure journal that read like an engineering log. Over time, he noticed patterns rather than panicking. He found comfort in the idea that you could learn faster than the market could punish. As Ethan's venture grew modestly, he faced the next big temptation, the offer to sell. An investor from the city offered a number that could have ended every practical worry. For a moment, the calculation seemed easy. Cash out, live comfortably, and never look back. For another moment, he imagined what quitting would mean. The scholarships that would no longer be funded. The apprentices who had been counting on his craft to learn. The system that only he had affordably bridged for years in that town. He went to Adrian and asked the hard question. How do you know when to sell? Adrian's answer was not a formula, but a litmus test. Ask 3 questions. Will the sale preserve or advance the mission? Will it keep you engaged in the work in a meaningful way? And does the structure of the deal protect the people who depend on the system? If the answers favor the mission, a sale can be leverage. If the answers favor comfort alone, walk away. Ethan negotiated terms that preserved scholarships, created a transition plan for apprenticeships, and ensured that the community stake remained. The sale transformed his life's axis, not collapsed it. With capital, he invested in training centers, leveraged his name to open doors, and multiplied the impact of his small systems. He did not, as Adrian consistently urged, divorce wealth from purpose. Through the years, Ethan learned to think in decades rather than quarters. He created a small fund to support businesses that showed both profitability and generosity. He partnered with community leaders to design curricula that taught skills directly translatable to employment. He measured success in placements and long-term earnings, not only in quarterly profit and loss statements. Infrastructure mattered as much as intent. Ethan invested in systems that could run without his daily attention. An operations manager trained to handle customer issues, a legal counsel who protected worker rights, financial dashboards that showed health at a glance. This work was unromantic but essential. It allowed him to do higher order things: strategy, mentorship, design. There were nights of loneliness. Becoming someone who builds systems distances you from some friendships and attracts others. People perceive wealth as a boundary and sometimes a threat. A few friendships frayed. Others deepened in surprising ways as old rivals became collaborators. Adrian taught him the art of boundaries, a necessary discipline to protect attention and to be fully present in the places that mattered. Perhaps the most delicate lesson was the management of desire. Money opens doors and changes people. Ethan watched colleagues who let scarcity thinking harden into greed, and he saw equally brilliant people who used wealth to widen the circle of agency. Adrian's counsel was mercilessly simple. Align incentives. If you design organizations where people's welfare is tied to impact, you align money with meaning. He created pay structures that rewarded quality and longevity, not simply short-term output. He gave employees equity, not as lip service, but as a real stake that changed decisions at every level. He learned that when people felt ownership of a mission, their creativity increased and their fidelity deepened. Time freedom became a North Star. Wealth, for Ethan, was always meant to buy the choice of how to spend his time. He learned to treat attention as a scarce asset. Meetings without clear outcomes were canceled. Email became a tool rather than a master. Deep work blocks, undisturbed hours to think, write, design, were guarded like holy time. He practiced the hard art of saying no. In the beginning, it felt like an insult to opportunity. Later, it felt like an act of preservation. Saying no to distractions and small vanity projects freed hours to mentor, to read, to invent. He found that the slower path often yielded faster and deeper outcomes. As the years folded into one another, Ethan confronted a larger question he had only glimpsed in the beginning. What is legacy? Many people dream of leaving behind monuments, titles, houses. Adrian reframed the question. What institutions will endure that allow people you never meet to flourish? He nudged Ethan to think about durability over glory, to design organizations that could teach people to build, not depend on a savior. So they built curricula, seeded microfinance programs managed by local committees, and funded small research grants for people solving local problems. Ethan's name was never meant to be carved in stone. He preferred the invisible rewards, watching a former apprentice open a shop, reading a letter from a mother who found steady income because of a new skill, seeing a network light up with new businesses. One winter, the town faced a hardship. A factory closed and unemployment spiked. Ethan's systems were not immune, but they were prepared. Courses were accelerated. A stipend fund provided immediate breathing room, and a cohort program matched trainees to remote work quickly. The response was imperfect but swift. The community felt it had agency rather than dependency. In the weeks that followed, some who had been skeptical became advocates. The true test of the billionaire mindset, Adrian said, was not how you flourish during good times, but how you allocate resources when others suffer. Ethan's relationship with money also matured. It ceased to be a single axis of meaning. He split returns into quadrants: reinvestment, living expenses, learning, and giving. This simple framework created clarity and reduced the constant, corrosive anxiety of chasing more. He watched the people he'd mentored begin to mentor others. The town transformed into a network of small enterprises that supported each other. A clothes maker who taught a youth, who then built a website for the carpenter, who then scaled distribution. Compounding, again, but this time social compounding, an economy that could multiply because people were intentionally interlinked. Adrian taught him how to protect reputation like a critical asset. Contracts, transparency, and the courage to admit mistakes became non-negotiable. When a product failed, Ethan would not run from it. He apologized, rebuilt, and compensated where necessary. This approach cost in the short term but paid in trust, and trust paid in the long term. The stranger who once sat across from him on a train was still a presence in Ethan's mind, although months had stretched into years. Adrian did not perform the dramatic vanishing act of many mentors and stories. He stayed present at a few critical junctures, then receded into the margins where a wise person belongs. He taught more by ceasing to be indispensable. A subtle change took place in Ethan that had nothing to do with bank balances. He slept differently. There were still nights of worry. Builders and leaders always have them, but the anxiety changed form. It was no longer an engulfing fog, but a focused list of things to solve. He found himself laughing more, taking time to teach, to listen, to sit with people. Wealth had not made him immune to disappointment, but it had given him capacity to respond. There were times when he could have chosen comfort over commitment. Offers arrived, luxury lifestyles, invitations to exclusive clubs, pressure to adopt habits that would impress rather than serve. He declined many of them. He understood the slippery edge of lifestyle inflation. As income grows, expenses are designed to keep you forever occupied. Instead, he built experiences that lined up with meaning, travel that deepened empathy, dinners that convened people solving real problems, investments that created local jobs. Publicly, he became modest. He refused the limelight in exchange for influence. He preferred the quiet power of a network that repaired itself. His work was not glamorous, but it was durable. He did not want headlines. He wanted institutions. Eventually, people began to ask for his advice. He met young founders whose proposals glittered with ambition, but lacked the scaffolding to sustain it. He taught them the same suite of things he'd learned. Start with craft, build systems, plan for the downside, own a piece of the value chain, and commit to giving the community of stakeholders a real voice in decisions affecting them. He asked the hardest questions. Who benefits if this project succeeds? Who is likely to lose, and how will they be mitigated? He cared about distribution as much as creation. Ethan's greatest satisfaction came not from any balance sheet, but from seeing others move from scarcity to choice. He watched a network grow where people could take risks because they had soft landings. He measured the outcomes the way an engineer measures stress tolerance, by the degrees of safety that allowed people to innovate without wrecking their lives. Years later, there was a ceremony of ordinary kind, a small ribbon cutting for a learning center in a neighboring town. A young woman, once a trainee, was leading the event. She thanked Ethan in a voice that carried both gratitude and authority. She spoke not as a beneficiary, but as a peer. Ethan stood to the side, his chest heavy in a good way, and thought of the path that had begun on a rainy train. He had become wealthy, to be sure, but he had also grown into the other currency that matters: usefulness. He measured legacy in the number of people who could now stand on their own 2 feet. He felt the kind of peace that comes from purposeful tiredness, exhaustion that follows a day of meaningful creation rather than a day of fruitless toil. Adrian, when they met again under a sky freckled with city lights, smiled without spectacle. "You have built something that wears well," he said. Ethan knew what Adrian meant. His wealth was not a fortress that isolated. It was a set of bridges that connected. It paid for more than comfort. It financed agency. It created work for others. It solved problems. "How did I know when to scale?" Ethan asked once, years earlier, when the decision had felt like a crossroad. Adrian's answer was simple then and remained true. When the mission requires scale to serve more people, scale. When scale requires you to compromise the core, do not scale. If the outcome multiplies the lives you care about, the appetite for growth is righteous. If it eats the purpose, it's vanity. Ethan repeated Adrian's rules in meetings, in written notes, in conversations with partners. He taught them to consult the mission before signing anything that glittered. It kept them honest and practical. He found that this exercise attracted collaborators who prized durability over spectacle. There were times the world tested him unfairly. Regulations shifted, a market collapsed, a rival used cheap tricks to steal market share. Each time, the systems they built, cash reserves, diversified income streams, long-term relationships, soothed the shock. They did not make him invincible, but they made him resilient. In the quiet moments, he sometimes allowed himself to recall the hungry, uncertain kid he had been. He did not regret the hunger. It had sent him out into the world. He honored it by teaching others to use their hunger as a compass, not a cage. When people asked what single habit had mattered most, he usually said this: cultivate patient, consistent action. There is no mystical shortcut. Start small, repeat, refine. The world is mostly built by people who kept showing up and improved their work just enough to be remarkable over time. Then, his life took on the cadence of mentoring. He developed programs that paired youth with local tradespeople, structured so that training produced revenue and dignity. He funneled capital into places that had proven ability to use it, and designed exit strategies that ensured local leaders controlled the institutions long after his money had been spent. He taught accounting as a language of stewardship, not a tool of exploitation. He taught negotiation as a way of protecting relationships. He taught the need to steward luck, too. When fortune visited, an unexpected partnership, a sudden demand, he documented how it had happened, and then designed a process to make similar outcomes more available to those who lacked his network. That was perhaps Adrian's most persistent lesson. When luck comes, map it, and then build bridges so that others can cross. Ethan aged in a way that felt like a story moved forward by careful hands. He still made mistakes, some costly. He learned to own them publicly and to repair them privately. His life was not heroic in any mythic sense. It was human, a string of choices that aligned over time. On quiet nights, he walked the streets he had once fled. He listened to conversations in cafes, now filled with people building their dreams. He recognized faces. Someone who had trained with his program, now running their own show. A former skeptic who had become a collaborator. The network felt alive. In the end, the billionaire mindset Adrian had taught him was less about amassing and more about arranging. It was arranging systems, arranging habits, arranging people so that agency could be distributed, not hoarded. It was reframing wealth as motion rather than deposit, as a current that turns mills rather than a single heap of gold. Ethan often thought of the man who had asked him about running toward or away. He thought about how small choices, saying yes to a train ride, taking small experiments seriously, splitting his resources into reinvestment and giving, had compounded into something that mattered. When new seekers came to him, in airports, at conferences, in small-town cafes, he did not recite a creed. He asked questions. What do you love? What skill are you willing to push until it becomes excellent? Who do you want to serve? Then he set them to a series of practical tests. Build something that serves a dozen people, then 100. Measure results. Learn. Iterate. He made them fail small and learn before risking everything. If there was a moment of quiet triumph, it was never a bank balance or a public award. It was the sight of a child learning a trade, of a woman opening a storefront with confidence, of a teacher using curriculums he helped design. Those faces with a true balance sheet. Adrian left the town as mysteriously as he had arrived, but his lessons stayed. Ethan never lost the sensation that he had been given not simply money advice, but a kind of moral architecture. He used wealth to unlock human potential rather than hoard it. He built ladders instead of towers. Years later, under the warm light of a community center bustling with workshops, a young person stood to the side and asked Ethan the same question he once asked Adrian. "How do I start?" Ethan handed the youth a small notebook. On the first page he had written, years ago and still true, "Start small. Plant one tree. Learn one craft. Teach one person. Build systems that can run without you and give away what you do not need. Split your money into quarters. Reinvest, live, learn, give. When in doubt, serve. When tempted by quick fame, return to the mission." The youth read, nodded, and left with a plan that fit into the narrowness of an ordinary life. Ethan watched them go and felt an unfamiliar pleasure. Not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet confirmation that the work continued. Wealth, for him, had become an instrument of possibility, not a curtain to hide behind, but a lamp to light paths. He'd learned to turn ambition into architecture, and to treat that architecture with humility. The story does not end with an absolute finish. There was still work to do in towns he had yet to visit, and in people he had yet to teach. The pillar of compounding kept moving forward, as did the need for stewardship and new structures. But one truth remained steady. The billionaire mindset is not a badge of superiority. It is a set of tools for shaping a life that creates options for oneself and others, that honors labor by turning it into leverage, and that rewrites luck into institutions that outlast a single life. If you go into the world tomorrow with a small sum and a head full of dreams, remember this. Choose craft over show. Build systems before scaling. Own parts of your future, and give like a builder. Wealth will follow the architecture you design. Build something that wears well.